Welcome to Torquay, the jewel of the English Riviera. One of the most popular seaside towns in the entire country, Torquay is well known for its lively atmosphere, often excellent weather, and its wealth of things to see and do along a stunning piece of Devon's coastline. So on our walk around Torquay on a beautiful summer's afternoon, we'll take a look at all this town has to offer, as we take in spectacular seaside views from the famous Princess Pier, navigate the narrow lanes of the oldest part of Torquay, discover the history of some of the town's most famous landmarks, learn about the legacy of the writer Agatha Christie, who was born in this town, and pass by just a handful of famous seaside hotels, which have helped to put this place on the map. All of that is to come over the next half hour, as we make our way around the town centre. But we begin our walk looking across the tranquil waters of the inner dock of Torquay Harbour, which is filled to the brim with boats parked in the shadow of the buildings and hills of the modern town centre. With splendid crowds of boats dotting the water and modern apartment blocks dotting the hills of Torquay, this view almost conjures up images of Monte Carlo on the French Riviera. But the similarities that Torquay shares with that famously extravagant European destination are actually much more than skin deep. In the late 19th century, this town became its own must-visit destination for the wealthiest members of Victorian society. And ever since, Torquay has thrived on the back of seaside tourism, still attracting large numbers of wealthy visitors who arrive here by yacht, hundreds of which we can see moored alongside one another in the much larger outer dock just here. The outer dock was built in the 1860s to expand the capacity of Torquay's historic harbour, which was once upon a time simply made up of the small, centuries-old inner dock just here. People have lived in Torquay for thousands of years, and long before the advent of tourism, this small harbour was used as a sheltered dock for ships belonging to the naval fleet in the English Channel. Today, however, things look rather different, particularly after the construction of this eye-catching modern bridge, which spans the channel between the inner and outer docks. It was built in 2003, and on the one hand it allows tourists to walk all the way around the inner dock, but on the other hand it also serves as a lifting bridge, which opens up periodically to allow boats to make their way between the two parts of the town's harbour. Over the last couple of hundred years, what was once a very small seaside settlement has become home to a dense collection of houses, hotels and more, which crowd around the historic harbour, both here at sea level, but also up on top of the so-called Seven Hills of Torquay, a collection of imposing landforms that dominate the scenery of this piece of coast. If you venture up onto one of Torquay's hills, you'll find a dizzying network of steep, snaking streets lined with small houses, grand holiday homes, and an endless array of hotels, designed to cater to the flocks of tourists who've been coming to this seaside resort for the best part of 200 years now. And offering some lovely views of the harbour, over here we find one of the most famous seafront hotels in Torquay, the delightful Hotel Regina. A traditional seaside lodging, the Regina is best known as having once been the home of the Victorian-era poet Elizabeth Barrett Browning, who was one of a number of literary figures to have spent much time in this beautiful resort town. Barrett Browning, along with Torquay native Agatha Christie, are just some of the famous faces who've brought this town to national attention over the years. But in the modern day, you might probably know Torquay best as the setting for one of the most famous television programmes in British history, Fawlty Towers. Yes, the classic hotel-based comedy is all based in Torquay. In fact, the show got its start when John Cleese and the rest of the Monty Python troupe were staying at the old Gleneagles Hotel in Torquay in the early 1970s. A hotel which was owned by a man who Cleese described as the marvellously rude Donald Sinclair, the real-life inspiration for Basil Fawlty himself. Since its 12 iconic episodes aired in the late 70s, Fawlty Towers has been quoted endlessly by comedy lovers all over the world. But despite what Basil Fawlty says, we actually must mention the war. Because just here in the shadow of the Hotel Regina, we find a memorial dedicated to the legacy of D-Day. As it was from Torquay's harbour here that thousands of Allied soldiers departed for the beaches of Normandy in 1944. 3 years after France fell to the Nazis, a plan known as Operation Overlord began to take shape here in Britain, a plan that would see the Allies launch an ambitious amphibious invasion of German-occupied France. But to get such a large fleet of boats across roughly 100 miles of the English Channel, huge slipways were built at numerous points on England's south coast. And just here we can see some of those slipways, built here in Torquay in 1943, and which took soldiers from dry land into the waters of the town's harbour. And of all the D-Day departure points in England, Torquay is one of the most notable, because it was from here that the United States 4th Infantry Division embarked on their journey across the Channel. And when they reached France, it's said that they were the very first of more than 120,000 men to land on the beaches of Normandy on the 6th of June 1944. Over the following few weeks, hundreds of thousands more Allied troops set sail for France, with Torquay's slipways serving a vital role in dispatching soldiers to the fight in mainland Europe, which turned the tide of the Second World War against the Nazis. But it wasn't just in the D-Day landings that Torquay played an important part in the Second World War. At the outset of the conflict, this seaside town was a destination for many child evacuees from Britain's big cities, while it was also a base for RAF training, and it played home to many Anzac and American troops in the years before 1944. However, because Torquay played such a big part in the war, it was unfortunately a target for the bombs of the Luftwaffe. In fact, more than 10,000 buildings in this town were damaged in German air raids throughout the conflict, and much of the town that we see today is the product of a post-war rebuild, though not necessarily everywhere. Lining the inner dock on this side is the busy Victoria Parade, a street home to a number of buildings that have stood in Torquay since the pre-war period. That includes this large building, the Harbour Point, which was built more than 100 years ago and has been used as everything from a radio studio to a restaurant, a hotel, a nightclub and more. Of course, as one of the country's most popular seaside holiday spots, Torquay's waterfront has always been bustling with activity. In the present day, people come here to relax on the beach just to the west of the town centre, and also to enjoy the many bars, restaurants, shops and arcades of the town's streets. But let's look back to the earliest days of tourism in this town, and ask ourselves why people started coming here in the first place. As we mentioned earlier, Torquay was once a much quieter place, with the harbour coming into use as a shelter for ships of Britain's Channel Fleet during the Napoleonic Wars in the early 19th century. With ships moored here, many captains and their families began spending more time in Torquay. But it actually wasn't until a couple of decades later that Torquay's tourist industry really began to gather steam, as it became increasingly popular among the upper classes of Victorian society to holiday by the sea. Initially, this was because many people believed that the fresh sea air and bracing sea water were beneficial to one's health. But over the course of the mid-19th century, the trend of seaside holidays became more of a fashion, and so the town of Torquay began shifting its focus towards entertaining the people who were coming to visit. To achieve this, many new attractions were built along the seafront, including everything from the Princess Pier, which we'll be visiting later, to beautiful pleasure parks and gardens beside the sea, as well as shopping arcades, grand hotels, and plenty of holiday homes with picture-perfect sea views. All of this came together in the latter decades of the Victorian era to make what was billed as the Queen of English watering places, or as we mentioned at the start of our walk, the jewel of the English Riviera. Wealthy Victorian visitors compared this stretch of Devon's coastline to the French Riviera for its fetching scenery and pleasantly mild climate. And after the turn of the 20th century, this grand clock tower, the Mallock Memorial Clock Tower, was built in 1902, in memory of the local MP, and as a celebration of the town's enduring status as a famous seaside resort. Since it was built, the clock tower has stood as one of the most recognisable landmarks of Torquay's seafront. But let's briefly make our way away from the coast and head inland, into one of the oldest parts of this historic town. As this sign tells us, just to the right we'll find a number of Torquay's vast collection of inns, historic lodgings for people to stay, eat and drink when on holiday here. Most of Torquay's hotels today are a mix of Victorian, Edwardian and post-war buildings. But tucked away here at the top of Park Lane, there stand two traditional inns, the Hole in the Wall and the Devon Arms. On the right is the Devon Arms, a historic inn that's been operating for nearly 300 years, since it opened back in 1740, a time when it wasn't obscured by modern buildings and actually looked directly over the harbour. The Devon Arms claims to be Torquay's oldest licensed establishment, but it's neighboured by another historic pub which makes a similar claim, the Hole in the Wall. This colourful inn is housed in a building that dates all the way back to 1540, believed to be the oldest building in central Torquay. But it likely hasn't been used as an inn for all of that time, instead opening its doors later in history to the townspeople, and many seafarers who used it as a refuge from the long arm of the law. In the late 17th and early 18th centuries in particular, Britain's coasts were busy with smugglers and pirates, and many would seek out small, isolated seaside settlements like Torquay here to keep their heads down while on dry land, with inns like the Hole in the Wall and the Devon Arms proving a favourite among many at the time. Remember that even as recently as 250 years ago, Torquay was a fairly small village of around 500 people, noted as being home to 5 inns which overlooked the small harbour. While the modern town of more than 60,000 people today has since spread out over a huge area on the northern side of Torquay, just here we find ourselves walking through what's generally thought to be the oldest part of the original village by the harbour, perched on the steep slope of what's known as Beacon Hill, one of those 7 hills of Torquay. Nowadays, like most of the other hills, Beacon Hill is populated by holiday homes and hotels, having in the past also played home to a large zoo, the controversial 1970s built Coral Island Entertainment Centre, and the historic Marine Spa. As such, this hill has played a major part in Torquay's thriving tourist industry through the years. But as it's located a little way up from the busy seafront, it's also home to a number of interesting buildings in which holidaymakers, residents and more would congregate when not out and about on the town. The building just up ahead, for example, is the Victorian-era Park Hill Masonic Centre, while just along from it in the cream-coloured house is the Torquay Theosophical Society, 2 meeting places where people in the town, whether here as a resident or simply a holidaymaker, would historically meet one another. In fact, as Torquay's population grew through the 19th century, this once small seaside village became quite the cultural melting pot, as people from all corners of the country met one another, shared similarities, and exchanged views in a number of different fields, with this fashionable seaside resort soon becoming home to a diverse collection of religious, academic, and artistic communities. Bear in mind that this thriving social sphere was largely reserved for the upper classes and celebrities of the day. During its heyday, in fact, countless famous names came to Torquay. Everybody from the acclaimed engineer Isambard Kingdom Brunel, to the science writer Charles Darwin, the former Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli, and yet more literary figures, from John Keats to Rudyard Kipling and Oscar Wilde, who regularly holidayed here in the 1890s, and who was later infamously imprisoned for a homosexual affair that often took place in this area. Meanwhile, a wealth of different religious communities also emerged as Torquay grew in popularity. For example, we've just been looking at the memorial hall of what was once upon a time Holy Trinity Church, a grand Church of England place of worship that opened back in 1896, and which served worshippers in Torquay until its closure in 1980. And although the church building here still stands tall, it's actually now used as quite a spectacular private residence. But the history of religion, although not immediately apparent when exploring the modern town centre, is actually a key part of Torquay's heritage. Because while the area that we've been exploring here on Beacon Hill is indeed the oldest part of the town by the harbour, it wasn't the first major place of settlement on the north side of Torquay here. In fact, a short distance to the west of what is now central Torquay, you'll find the site of Tor Abbey, a 12th century monastery which gave birth to the town that we know today. Tor Abbey, which you can still visit today, was once upon a time one of the wealthiest monasteries in all of England, situated a short distance inland by the ancient village of Tor. As you might have deduced, the harbour here acted as the key for the abbey and village of Tor, hence the name of this town, Torquay. The abbey's existence supported the small population of people living by the Torquay, and it stood for more than 300 years, before it was eventually forced to close in 1539, on the orders of King Henry VIII, during his dissolution of the monasteries campaign. The dissolution of the monasteries laid waste to hundreds of historic religious sites all over England, and that's why you'll find so many monastery ruins up and down the country. But Tor Abbey here is unusually well preserved, today serving as a major attraction not only for its impressive collection of medieval heritage, but also splendid Georgian buildings, the beautiful Abbey Park which looks out over the sea, and the third largest art collection in all of Devon, composed mostly of 19th century works by an array of famed artists. So if you're looking to uncover the oldest heritage in modern Torquay, remember to venture up Park Lane to the Hole in the Wall and the Devon Arms, and then to the west of the town to Tor Abbey. But here we've made our way back to the harbour, which has been the centre of life in Torquay ever since holidaymakers first started coming here. What was once home to a small collection of houses and inns has been transformed into a vibrant seaside resort, frequented by huge numbers of tourists in the modern day. Today Torquay is by far one of the most popular seaside towns in the whole of the UK. In fact, around 4.5 million people visit Torquay every year, with more than a quarter of those staying overnight here on the English Riviera. As one of the country's premier coastal resorts then, there's something for everyone in Torquay. But how did this town transition from being a retreat for the wealthy to a destination for the masses? Well, we mentioned earlier that the 19th century saw a gradual change from Torquay's early popularity as a place where people came for health reasons to a place where people increasingly came for social purposes, both in the summer but also regularly in the winter. However, by the end of the Victorian era at the turn of the 20th century, Britain's population had changed dramatically, and ever more people from ordinary working backgrounds were becoming able to afford summer holidays by the sea, providing Torquay with a much, much larger audience than ever before. So in the 1900s, Torquay pivoted away from the upper classes towards attracting ordinary families from all over England, particularly the Midlands and the North. With London already surrounded by a wealth of resorts in easy reach of the capital, Torquay eyed the much larger market of people from thriving industrial towns and cities further north, advertising the warm weather and eye-catching scenery of the English Riviera, down here on the south coast, as a truly exotic getaway, compared with the more traditional northern resorts of Blackpool, Cleethorpes and more. This strategy worked like a charm, not only driving up visitor numbers in the short term, but also spreading the word far and wide that Torquay was one of the nation's premier seaside destinations. In the modern day, the millions of people visiting this town come from every corner of the country, and even further afield, with the international fame of Agatha Christie, Fawlty Towers and more driving foreign visitors to this fantastic south coast destination too. But when you're in Torquay, there's plenty more to do than simply take in the sea views. Because here we find ourselves at the bottom of Fleet Street, Torquay's main shopping street. The bottom of Fleet Street here, where the Green Ginger pub is to our left, was once home to a luxurious parade of Victorian shops and hotels. But as mass tourism began to take the lead in the 20th century, this part of town became a centre for major redevelopment to meet the needs of the ever larger crowds of visitors coming to town. Now historically, Fleet Street ran through the heart of Torquay's Old Town, taking its name from the Fleet, a river that once flowed freely across Torquay, but is now covered over by the tarmac beneath our feet. Above ground on the opposite side of the road, meanwhile, we can see the long and rather eye-catching Fleet Walk shopping centre, which opened back in 1989 as a brand new central shopping plaza for Torquay. Today, Fleet Walk is home to dozens of shops, restaurants, and an ambitious open-air walkway overlooking the street here, which tells you all you need to know about how good the weather can be in this part of the country. However, while the shopping centre is a fairly busy centre of activity away from the seafront, it was far from popular when it first opened back in the 80s. Facing the shopping centre, the other side of Fleet Street is lined with a number of much older buildings, some dating back to the Victorian era. And it was buildings and historic streets like these which were demolished to make way for Fleet Walk, the new shopping centre added to the list of controversial building projects among Torquay locals in the late 20th century. That does mean that this part of town, once home to a number of exquisite Victorian shopping parades and arcades, doesn't quite have the same historic charm at first glance. But it's interesting to ponder just how much this street has changed through the decades, in keeping with Torquay's continued status as one of the country's busiest seaside resorts. If you are looking out for some older buildings though, here at the bottom of Fleet Street once again, there stands the former Torquay Bank building on the left, which was built around the year 1900, and which stands at one end of the Vaughan Parade, that follows the line of the harbour's inner dock. But instead of returning to complete the circle around the inner dock, we're going to take a walk down Polk Street here, which runs between Fleet Street and the outer dock. And it takes its name from a man named Lawrence Polk, who was responsible for the construction of the outer dock in the late 19th century, which attracted wealthy yacht sailors to the town for the first time. In just a few minutes, we'll take a walk around the outer dock and have a nosy look at just a few of the extravagant modern yachts that you'll find in Torquay. But just beside the bars and restaurants of Polk Street, you'll also find a rather humble statue dedicated to the most famous person to have ever come out of Torquay, the world-renowned author Agatha Christie. Born back in 1890 at a large Victorian house known as Ashfield, which overlooked the sea from up on high, Agatha Christie grew up and lived in Torquay for more than 20 years, before her first marriage took her away to London at the end of the First World War. It was while she lived in London that she began writing her world-famous detective novels. But as she rose to become one of Britain's most popular authors of the interwar period, she regularly returned to Ashfield here in Torquay, her beloved childhood home by the sea, a source of comfort away from the busy social scene in the big city. It was only in 1940 that Christie reluctantly sold Ashfield, and the home was sadly demolished in 1962. But although you can no longer visit the place where she grew up, there are plenty more places around Torquay to learn about the legendary author's legacy. Here, meanwhile, we're passing by the Torquay Pavilion, a grand former theatre that was opened all the way back in 1912, and for many decades set itself apart as one of the most popular playhouses in Torquay. Having seen performances by names ranging from Laurence Olivier to Ken Dodd, Sid James, and many more, the Torquay Pavilion was a lively place of entertainment for more than 60 years, until its eventual closure in 1976. Today, the old pavilion stands empty, having briefly been converted into an amusement centre and a shopping arcade. But it retains a prominent position at one end of these sprawling seafront gardens, known as the Princess Gardens. With the historic Victorian-era Torbay Hotel just behind the trees here, these gardens have long been a major feature on Torquay's glistening waterfront, originally laid out back in the 1890s. Initially, these formal gardens, complete with colourful flower beds, an ornate fountain, and more, were more than just a place for people to walk about. In fact, they were a venue for Torquay's wealthy visitors to see and be seen by one another, a key part of the thriving social sphere in this fashionable Victorian retreat. Nowadays, the gardens are a great place to get in a spot of sunbathing, enjoy the outdoors, and relax by the sea, with the many boats of the outer dock visible just a short distance away on the other side of this large green, which briefly interrupts the course of the Princess Parade, the main waterside walkway running from the harbour towards the Princess Pier. The parade and pier, which we'll visit shortly, were also developed in the late 19th century, and they were all named after the daughter of Queen Victoria, one Princess Louise, who also came to lay the foundation stone for the gardens just beside us here. Now there's plenty more history to these delightful gardens. In fact, the Princess Gardens even appeared in one of Agatha Christie's most famous novels, The ABC Murders, which starred the famed detective Hercule Poirot. Meanwhile, here in the heart of the gardens, we find the prominent Torquay War Memorial, erected back in 1921, and which pays tribute to the men and women of Torquay who lost their lives fighting in the First and Second World Wars, along with a number of other major conflicts of the 20th century. From beside the memorial, we can look down along the Princess Gardens, although you can get an even better view if you head on up to the top of the English Riviera Wheel, the huge Ferris wheel providing spectacular views over the town centre, the sparkling waters of Torbay, and the 7 hills of Torquay. There are so many wonderfully scenic places to sit back and take in the views here, but the Princess Parade is probably the very best. This always lively waterfront promenade passing alongside the busy outer dock of Torquay Harbour, which as we can see is filled to the brim with boats of all shapes and sizes. Now, as we know, the outer dock was originally developed in 1880 by local politician Lawrence Polk, and today it's home to more than 600 berths where boats can dock, in both the town dock and the larger open marina just here. Together making up the outer portion of the harbour, they're often a hive of marine activity, which is keenly watched by passers-by. Although, if we look back inland for a moment, we'll also see that the Princess Parade here is home to another performing arts venue, the large Princess Theatre. Opened back in 1961, this is a much more modern playhouse than the old pavilion that we saw a short while ago, with capacity for 1,500 audience members to watch a variety of travelling shows. The very first performance here staged by none other than Tommy Cooper and Morecambe and Wise. Ever since, the Princess Theatre has cemented itself as one of Torquay's leading events venues, where you can see plays, stand-up comedy, concerts and much more. Just another example of how many things there are to do when you visit Torquay on holiday. Of course, a trip to the theatre is probably best done in the evening, because you don't want to squander the brilliant daytime sunshine, available to enjoy in all its glory by taking a walk along the bustling Princess Parade. However, if you fancy getting a closer look at the marina and the rest of the beautiful waters of Torbay, then it's well worth taking a walk along the historic Princess Pier, just here. Built back in 1890, a period when pleasure piers were all the rage in British seaside towns, the Princess Pier provided people with the then unusual experience of walking out into the middle of the sea, surrounded by waves on all sides. But with such a lengthy history of more than 130 years, Torquay's Princess Pier has changed somewhat over time. Originally, it was built simply as a concrete jetty that jutted out into the water, and only later was it redeveloped with the traditional wooden planks, benches and more that allowed people to relax as they strolled out to sea. And that's been an activity beloved by visitors to Torquay ever since the pier first opened, with a wealth of truly beautiful views to enjoy wherever you look. On this side of the pier we can gaze across the busy berths of Torquay's marina, with yachts, speedboats and more bobbing up and down on the water in the shadow of Beacon Hill in the distance and the English Riviera wheel to the left. As we mentioned earlier, it's views like this that conjure up that luxurious Monte Carlo-esque atmosphere befitting of a region known as the English Riviera, with the development of this expansive outer dock still attracting wealthy visitors from all over the world, many of whom pitch up in huge multi-million-pound super yachts. But there's much more to Torquay's waterfront than the harbour here, because the pier, which doubles as one of the marina's outer walls, also allows us to gaze out across the sea, with the calm waters of Torquay sparkling under the summer sun. Just in the distance, we can see the large Torquay beach curving around the northern shore of Torquay, filled to the brim with people enjoying the sun, sea and sand. While if you venture into the trees just beyond the beach, you'll find the remains of Tor Abbey, Torquay's Victorian-era railway station, beautiful landscaped gardens, and yet more historic hotels. But Torquay isn't the only place you need to visit to enjoy the stunning scenery of Torquay. This town, located on the northern shore of this huge south coast bay, is only one of 3 brilliant towns that gaze out over the sea here. On the western side of the bay, just a couple of miles from the area that we're looking at now, you'll find the town of Paignton, a huge seaside resort home to its own sprawling beach, historic pier, and a wealth of traditional attractions, amusement arcades, and more. Directly opposite Torquay on the south side of the bay, meanwhile, is the historic fishing port of Brixham, the site of a number of significant historical events over the centuries, and well worth visiting for its scenic, winding alleys and illustrious heritage. Together, Brixham, Paignton and Torquay make up the area we now know as Torquay, roughly analogous to the term the English Riviera, of which Torquay here is undoubtedly the crown jewel. Now, as we mentioned, Torquay's Princess Pier has changed a bit over time, having also lost some of its historic features. Once upon a time, at the head of the pier you would have found a large building, known as the Islander, which was home to an entertainment centre, a common structure on British seaside piers. However, the Islander was lost to a large fire in 1974, leaving the pier in the modern day simply as a place to take a walk alongside the marina, which may look calm now, but which can also be full of action itself. If you keep an eye out, you might even see a bit of marine life in the waters of the harbour here, particularly grey seals, who swim about between the boats. Many different seals come and go, but in recent years Torquay has been home to its own resident grey seal, named Sammy, who was first spotted in Brixham Harbour on the other side of the bay, but who occasionally swims across to Torquay here. So do look out for him when you're walking along the Princess Pier. However, while we keep a lookout for Sammy the Seal, it's here on the Princess Pier that we've sadly come to the end of our walk around the fantastic seaside town of Torquay. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you're now looking forward to visiting Torquay for yourself sometime soon.